I did not. I did mine yesterday. I'll see the screenshot that George sent me so about how to do it. It's really, yeah, I did the recheck. I think, good morning, everybody. And then we're gonna do that all. Just, yeah, all right.
Well, I thought I'd share with you the Halloween costumes last night. How many people have actually seen in Kansas? Okay, we have some. You guys have some younger nieces and nephews or something. Yeah, so this was good as I can do for rats on my back, little but yeah, so it was fun. I'm guessing nobody knows who Christian is. Anybody know Huggy Wuggy?
No.
It's weird. Yeah, it's this weird little like game with a bunch of kids and I didn't go play. So very scary little game. But our big boy wasn't there. Let's see, where's he at? Thorin was there, but he was too cool to be with us. Oh, oh yeah, no. Yeah, he just wore his DMX clothes, was just a way to kind of look like he was dressed up and get candy. But it disappeared. So, never mind. You've seen him in his BMX clothes before, so that's all he was. But he got a pillowcase like this, March candy, just like ridiculous. Yeah, kind of crazy. Anybody dress up last night? Nobody, not a single person. Yeah, with your son, yeah. Yeah, awesome. Yeah.
Very scary.
Yeah.
Very scary.
Yeah, we got some good, had a good Batman back there. Right? It's like in a pumpkin. Pumpkin, yeah, that's awesome.
There's nothing cuter than like a small child.
Well, let's see.
Yeah.
Plan, if you guys have kids, Halloween does become a lot more fun again. I know it's kind of fun as a kid and it's kind of like, and something like early young adult, and then it's like super fun when you have kids. They have some. Yeah. So, all right. Well, yeah, so there was one question on the quiz that the key was wrong for. Yeah, somebody had emailed me about it, so let me know. So the one that was talking about blood vessel innervation, and the first one should have been sympathetic nervous system only, but the key initially had parasympathetic nervous system only. So if your grade changed by 0.1, that was what. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any other questions on the quiz? In general, I did pretty well on it. Yeah. We're diving into day 2, cardiovascular system today. So we'll be looking at the blood vessels, kind of blood flow control. And we'll look at a little bit of the cardiac as well as blood flow regulation. And we'll look at the blood flow in the heart. So, yeah, ability and we can just kind of do that sometime in the middle. Yeah, we'll just do it sometime. All right. So we'll have one more week of material next Monday. That'll be the last one on the cardiovascular system. And then we have to next Friday. Okay. One of these days, actually for the final, I get to be here. And I don't know if people like dogs, but I could bring Betsy in. Yeah, for example, we could do that because I actually get to be here during final week. Very calming, very sweet. Yeah,
Very
about as sweet as they come.
strong positive feelings.
Yeah. I used to bring her to. I'd bring her to exam sometimes on the campus and kids always talk about testing and track. We need to create up a little bit. Yeah, so exam 4 we'll try to
She was here.
All right, well, let's jump in here. So, yeah, talking about blood vessels today. I did update the PDF last Friday, so, there's not too much change, but there's one slide that's that is totally different. So if you downloaded this before last Friday, you may just want to grab that as a PDF. I'll just tell you when we get to that slide, what's different. But just, you know, okay. All right, well, let's jump in here. So, we're gonna talk about, okay, yeah, so we'll talk about the different types of blood vessels. One kind of amazing thing about the vascular system in the body is if we took every single blood vessel and put them into hands, it would be right around 60,000 miles inside of each of us. And 99% of that is capillaries, right? Mostly microscopic. Only one red blood cell can fit through in time, right? Very small. But just this incredibly vast network of a system to transport things around the body, right? And that's literally 2.5 times around the world inside of each place, right? So it's just an incredible system that we have to transport things. Okay. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about each of these types of vessels. Obviously, you guys know what these are, right? Arteries, which way is this going? Obviously, away from the heart, right? So, yeah, so away from the heart, veins are going back towards the heart. And capillaries are where all exchange happens, right? This is where kind of the business of the vascular system happens. So all exchange is here, right? So this is where we drop off oxygen, pick up CO2, drop off nutrients, pick up waste products, all those different things. It all has to happen in the capillaries, right? If we got blood in arteries, veins, we don't diffuse things through those walls. It's only in the capillary for the time. Okay, a couple different types of kind of like a couple anomalies in the vascular system are known as anastomosis. You guys look at anastomosis at all?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. You guys are there then. Yeah. So what's an example of an arterial anastomosis? Yeah, that's fantastic. What about in the brain? What's the big one in the brain called? Circle of Willis. Circle of Willis. Circle of Willis. Yeah, right. Circle of Willis is yeah. So really, when the arteries are connecting to each other without hitting the capillary bed first, right? So normally it's going to go artery, capillary bed, vein, right? If we go artery to artery, then that's different, right? That's a different type of setup. And this is almost always so it's an arterial anastomosis, right? This is always helpful in if one side of that anastomosis is blocked for some reason, right, then we can still get blood all the way around to the other side of that blockage via that anastomosis, right? So that's just kind of a protective mechanism in important places like the heart and the brain, but we have other places as well. Arteriovenous anastomosis. What's the other term for this? We go right from artery to vein, skip capillary bed, shunt. Yeah, right. So, you guys know your stuff. I'm glad. That's good. Protective. The shunt, right? Almost all of our capillary beds have these, right? Where we can skip capillary beds if we need to. We can have a closed capillary bed, then it goes through the shunt. When we open up the capillary bed, then it doesn't go through the shunt. It goes through the capillary bed. Exchange can happen, right? And then venous anastomosis, we have these. This is much more common on the venous side. The venous side of the vascular system is way less organized than the arterial side, right? So veins tend to connect to each other pretty commonly, right? So when we look at these different types of vessels here, yeah, to take a second and just label these with the person next to you to make sure we're on the same page, and then we'll move on.
C. Patty.
Here.
That's why
You would be our team.
Wow. I had a. Oh.
Let's go ahead and put back together here. So let's just go through these quickly here. So which letter would be the artery? Vein, vein, good, capillary, yeah, good. And then an arterial anastomosis. D, right? There's a lot of them in there, really, right in that whole circle of Willis. It's a chain of anastomosis, a bunch of them that all connect to each other. Okay, venous anastomosis, D, yeah. And then arterial venous shunt. Yeah, the last one left there, which is also that arteriovenous anastomosis. Wait, oh no, not N, sorry. Which one did E? There we go. Yeah, I didn't really fill anything in on the kind of function of the venous anastomoses. Because yeah, I don't know if there really is like a solid function of those besides the fact that the veins just kind of connect to each other like that. I'm sure it improves blood flow in some way, but it's not it's just kind of the way that we see a lot of veins just connect to each other. I'm sure it allows for greater blood flow return in some way, but yeah, it doesn't have a super important protective function like the other ones we talked about. So okay, questions on those categories at all? Okay, so just the general structure of blood vessels. Did you guys go through these in anatomy as well? Different layers of the blood vessel walls. Okay, yeah. So most blood vessels have these three layers. Okay, so our most external layer, which is known as the adventitia, it's called the tunica externa. This is the thick, kind of fibrous layer that is protective. Kind of gives it some structure, gives it some strength to be able to withstand forces. And the tunica media is where the smooth muscle is, right? So it's the middle layer. And most of the time with all these tubular types of tissues that we've talked about so far, the middle layer, the outer layer is always got a fibrous protective layer, the inner layer, and the middle layer is always muscle. Right? Talked about this, the GI tract, the respiratory, or respiratory tract, the reproductive tract, right? The uterus is this way. All those different tubes are kind of similar where we have this outer tough layer, middle muscular layer, and then inner is some kind of epithelial layer. So it's all follows that kind of pattern all throughout. Okay, so middle layer, this is how we change blood vessel size, right? Like contracted and relaxing that smooth muscle. Okay, when we contract it, that's small vasoconstriction, right? Which will decrease blood flow beyond it. Okay. When we relax it, that leads to vasodilation and increased blood flow beyond. And we'll talk about more in detail in the dynamics of how those vasoconstriction, vasodilation changes blood flow systemically versus locally, which that does kind of differ. Okay, and then lastly, the tunica intima, called the interna, is this inner layer that's very smooth. This is that endothelial tissue, right? So this is a version of epithelial tissue. Specifically, the vascular endothelium is that single layer of cells that is continuous to the whole 60,000 miles of blood vessels. Right? So this is one continuous layer that goes through the whole vascular system. Okay. When we get to the capillaries, this is all capillaries. Is that during the internal? There's no smooth muscle. There's no fibrous layer on the outside. It's just that internal layer. But the other ones have all three of these in some level. Endothelial cells are incredibly important for the health of the cardiovascular system. endothelial dysfunction. So when these little cells aren't working properly, that's really the kickoff events of cardiovascular disease. That's really what's going to lead to atherosclerosis, which is a heart attack and stroke, which are the number one cardiovascular disease, the number one killer in Western civilization. Right? And it all really starts with the health of these endothelial cells to do their job, which is to one of the jobs that they do is to produce and release nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a strong vasodilator. Talk about that some today, but it also has very strong anti-inflammatory properties. When those cells aren't producing nitric oxide, then that pretty much invites the immune system into the blood vessel walls, which is the whole starting point of plaque buildup, which is what is atherosclerosis. So very, very important to help with those endothelial cells. Okay. Questions on those at all? Okay, so we got those three layers. We can kind of see them here, right? We can see that inner endothelial layer, right? We can see a bit of that basement membrane, right? That which would be the connective tissue underneath those endothelial cells. Okay, we can see our smooth muscle layer, which is much thicker in arteries and in veins. Right? We can change the size of arteries a lot more drastically than we can change the size of veins, but we can vasoconstrict and vasodilate veins, so which is helpful. And then we have the tunica externa, that thicker kind of fibrous layer that also houses small blood vessels and nerves. Okay, and then we can obviously see the capillary bed here, and in the individual capillary tube, you can see it's just that first layer, just that tunica intima. Doesn't have the smooth muscle, doesn't have the tunica externa. Okay, we see something unique over here on the venous side. What is that? The valve, absolutely. Right, so we got that valve there. Okay, that's really just it's made up of endothelial cells, so it's that same as it's just like an external portion of the tunica intima. These endothelial cells form valves all throughout the vascular system, because there's really no pressure on the venous side. Right? We don't have a lot of pressure over there. So in order to continue the progress of getting blood back to the heart, it helps to have these points to where, which it's not going to go backwards. Right? We get past that valve, and then we kind of make sequential progress. Right? We push it past that valve, can't get back. We push it past the next valve, can't get back. Right? That's because there's really not much pressure at all over there. When the blood travels through the capillary bed, it's so small that it loses almost all of the pressure at that point. So we need those valves to help us get the blood down. Okay. Right. So when we look at our blood in general, a pie chart, like where we would find most of our blood at rest, over half of it is in our big veins. Okay, so 55% of our blood is just kind of sitting, slowly moving through our big veins. Sorry, my camera keeps kicking off here. Let me try something different here real quick. There we go. Let's try it that way. Yeah, so one of the main functions of the venous side of our vascular system is to be a reservoir for blood. Okay, and we can see that here, right? We have all this blood just sitting there, kind of. It is not just sitting; it is moving, but not very much. Right? On the venous side, it's just kind of slowly moving through there. That's why it's really important when you're on a flight or something, or you're sitting for long, you're trying to start contracting the muscles, right? Because otherwise, that blood really is just pooling out in that big vein. And it can start to clot and things like that in certain cases. So that's a big function of the venous side, is to be a reservoir for blood. Yeah, we'll talk more about that in a second. Questions about that? Yeah.
I don't know how long that most of what is, I think, but you want to tell the exact number for everyone?
No, just what I just talked about there. I said, yeah, don't even memorize these numbers. It's just the idea that a big chunk of our blood sits in our veins and acts as a reservoir for blood. And we talked about this a bit last time. We talked about how we increase preload when we start exercising. One of the primary ways we do that, well, we got to increase venous return, right? And so one of the primary ways we do that is we vasoconstrict these systemic veins, right? We squeeze those down, that mobilizes this big blood pool, right? And all of a sudden we got a lot more blood coming back to the heart. And so our preload can go up a lot, which helps to increase that stroke volume, which allows us to increase the cardiac output. Correct? Okay. All right. So on the artery side of things, we'll talk about all the three capillary type or three vessel types here, a little bit more. So on the arterial side, obviously they're biggest at the heart, right? They're smaller as they move away. Okay. The in arteries, the tunica media is the largest layer out of those three. Okay. This is because of smooth muscle. And we got a lot of smooth muscle arteries, so we can change the size. Okay, so we can change the size of those arteries, but it's also protective against high blood pressure. Okay, so we get on the arterial side, there's a lot more blood pressure than there is on the venous side, especially the big arteries right here next to the heart. Those have to withstand the most pressure of all, right? And so this tunica media layer, that big muscular layer, gives it some strength, so it be able to handle that. Okay, the larger arteries are very elastic. Okay, and we talked about this a little bit last time. We talked about how that the whole pulse wave idea, when the heart contracts, it stretches out the aorta, right? And then that same stretch makes its way all the way through our arterial system, all the way down to wherever we can feel an artery, right? That's that same pulse that we feel. It all started in the heart, right? So it stretches out. But then the cool part about it is that stretch isn't just like something to withstand force, it also bounces back. And then it kind of pushes the blood along and keeps the speed up of the blood, right? So it stretches out and then bounces back hard. And that is a hugely important part of maintaining blood pressure throughout our vascular system, is that bounce back of our elastic artery. Okay. So this helps to support against high blood pressure. Okay, but then also stretch and bounce back to keep blood pressure back. Okay, so stretch out that artery, bounce it back, and that helps us maintain blood pressure. Okay, once we get down to our smaller arteries, known as arterioles, which are also known as the resistance vessels. This is really the primary area of systemic blood pressure control in the body. Okay, for one, because there's a lot of them. Right, so that means we have a lot of those vessels, which means we have a lot of blood sitting, a good proportion of our blood sitting in those, or at least found in those at any given time. They're not quite as elastic, but there's a lot of smooth muscle, so we can change the size of these resistance vessels a lot. Okay, so blood pressure control. Okay, so this is a major site of blood pressure control. Okay, so we're talking about these little arterioles down here. So it's that part right before we get down to the capillary beds, and we can, since there's so many of them, and that means there's a lot of blood there, changing the size of all of those at once causes a drastic effect on our blood pressure. This is the primary way that we control our blood pressure with changing blood vessel size, is by changing the size of those arterioles, known as resistance vectors. Okay, questions on any of that? All right, so a little bit about the venous side of things. So obviously these are increasing in size as they move towards the heart. Really, it's the same on both, but it's just that the blood is traveling in the opposite direction. Right? Vessels are always bigger towards the heart, smaller away from the heart. But blood is traveling towards the heart here. Obviously, the big function is to get blood back to the heart. One we already talked about, allows the cooling of blood. Okay, and we can mobilize this blood pool by vasoconstriction. And that's mostly via sympathetic nervous system activity. That's activity. Okay, we talked about the muscle pump and the thoracic pump a little bit last time. But again, by those muscles squeezing down, that allows us to push blood through. That wouldn't be possible really without valves, right? That wouldn't be anywhere as close to as helpful of a mechanism if we didn't have valves, because blood gets pushed both directions when you just squeeze on a vessel, right? So we have to have something to make sure that blood's going the right direction with that increase in pressure. Audrey?
So vasoconstriction, what is that?
What is that in reference to? Is that vasoconstriction of the vein, like the muscle pumping?
Yeah, so kind of two separate things. The question there is kind of one of the functions of the veins being that they're a reservoir of blood. And so that's allowing blood filling. And so when we want to mobilize that blood flow and bring more of that blood back into general circulation, we squeeze down all the veins a little bit. And then that sends more of it back towards the heart. And so then we just have that immediately increases our amount of blood flow that's kind of actively moving through the body. That can increase our venous return, increase our preload, that's how we increase brain output.
I didn't think it's for people to it.
Yeah, so they do have some level of smooth muscle, not a ton. If we go back to this image here, we can see kind of some smooth muscle cells scattered around the little veins. Definitely not as dense as the arteries, but there is some capability of veins to constrict and dilate. So, yeah, absolutely. Okay. Other questions on this? Okay. All right, so the structure of the walls of the veins, the layers are definitely thinner than all of the artery layers of even if the arteries are the same size. The thickest layer in veins is that external layer, that tunica externa. Okay, so this is really supporting veins. Which also this helps them to be anchored to CT for connective tissue, wherever they're at, right? So veins are much floppier than arteries, as you guys have experienced in the cadavers, right? And so it helps for them to have this thicker external layer, and then that is woven into the connective tissue around, so they can be kind of supported well, because they are so much more floppier. Okay, unique part about the tunica intima, again, it forms valves. Okay, not every vein has valves, not the big, large veins of thoracic cavity things don't necessarily have valves. And this is more common out in the veins in our necks, when we're further away from the heart, harder to get that blood back. Yeah, so obviously, this is fighting against gravity. Okay, and they just kind of keep the progress. It's kind of the way to think about it. Progress of blood flow. I would make kind of sequential progress as that blood is making its way past one valve to the next valve to the next valve. Okay, the smallest veins, the ones that are just on the other side of capillary beds, are known as venules. Okay, so we got arterioles on the one side, then it goes to capillary bed, then it goes to venules. Okay, questions on what I wrote up there?
Yeah, what does that say?
So it just says progress of blood flow. So taking its way past the valve, or another valve. I got a little out of hand there. Okay. Another unique parts of or another unique type of veins are the venous sinuses. Did you guys see any? Did you guys get to look at any of these in the heart before? Yeah. Cool. That's awesome. Great. Yeah. You know what these are about. We also have a dural venous sinus up in the brain as well. So kind of like big flat veins that they can just completely collapse and there's not much in them. And then they can kind of fill up with blood at other times. So yeah, unique parts of the vascular system. Okay, let's see if this little video works. Part of the research that I do involves ultrasound, and all my research in my doctoral program was all related to endothelial function, and so looking at the health of those blood vessels. And so part of what we do with that is we measure the brachial artery, which is right here in this image. But every once in a while, when you're looking at the brachial artery, you get a good view of the brachial vein too, which is right there. It's not actually working. I have to switch over my computer to see, but right below the brachial artery, so we got brachial artery right here, brachial vein right here. And we talked about, you guys have seen it in the cadavers, that veins and arteries are mostly dropping together, right? They're kind of right next to each other, which is helpful for multiple things, but it's helpful for venous return, like we talked about last time. When that artery, when the heart contracts and stretches out that artery, smashes down the vein a little bit. And so you'll actually be able to see when I play this video, this is a Doppler, as part of the ultrasound right here. It's picking up the blood, the movement of the blood flow. And so then it's measuring velocity down there in the bottom with each beat of the heart. And so you'll see, you'll see each beat going up, and with each beat, there's a little bit of backflow too, which you see here, which is normal in the artery. But then every once in a while, you get a good view of a valve in the vein, and that's why I'm showing you this video here. Because you can see this valve in the brachial vein just opening and closing every time the heart beats. And that kind of goes along with what we talked about, that when that artery stretches out, it actually pushes blood through the vein. And the valve opens up every time it happens when it closes up. So yeah. There we go. So you can see the leaflet, two little leaflets of the valve right there. Right, and it corresponds with the pulse wave down there as well. And you can see that artery stretches out each time it happens. Yeah, so great. Nice view of the vein.
It's like that.
Yeah, it's pretty rare to actually, I was just like, doing it, and all of a sudden, like, oh, there's something flapping around, what is that? Yeah. Okay. All right, so that is the venous side, so we'll talk a little bit about capillaries. And obviously this is between the venules and the arterial, okay? This is where, again, where all the exchange happens, okay? Again, the structure includes only that endothelium wall with some connective tissue underneath. And that actually depends on which type of capillary, whether or not it has, so the endothelial layer has endothelial cells, but underneath is that little connective tissue layer, basement membrane. Some capillary beds don't even have that basement membrane, they're just the endothelial cells. But we'll look at those on the capillary types on the next slide. So capillary beds are going to have this meta-arterial, which again is just another name for that shunt, right? So arterial venous anastomosis. Okay, and then there's the true capillary bed, which is where all this exchange happens. Somewhere between 10 and 100 little vessels in a capillary bed. And obviously the very smallest lumen is the internal part of the vessel. Literally only a single red blood cell fits through the time. So like single file line of red blood cells passing through the capillaries. And then we got these special precapillary sphincters, which can be opened or closed, which coincides with vasodilation. So if we're we'll talk about these more, but if we're in an area where there's a lot of metabolism going on, like an exercising limb, right? If we're doing some exercise with our leg, then we're going to vasodilate to that area and vasodilate our arteries, our arterial, some more blood there. But that same vasodilation, same things that kick off vasodilation of the arteries are also going to open up those precapillary sphincters and allow that to open up. So we don't just send more blood there, we also send that blood through the capillaries as well to exchange nutrients. Okay. All right, so this is the slide that's a bit different than if you downloaded the PDF before last Friday. And part of this was in conjunction with Dr. Balta, because there's a lot of confusion out there. There's not really a full consensus on these categories of capillaries, and it was always kind of a sticky point. And so I was looking into it more, and I ended up asking him, and he kind of said this is probably the easiest way to look at it, but it's not. It's only 100% agreed upon the different capillary types. But in general, we look at it this way. There's this idea of a fenestration, first of all. What's a fenestration? You know what that is? It's a hole. Absolutely. That's what it is. It's a hole. Okay. And so when you see a fenestrated capillary bed, that means that endothelial cells themselves have holes in them. Right? It means literally not just like between the cells, but the cells themselves actually have holes in them. Right? And so we kind of have two different types of continuous capillary beds. So when it's talking about continuous or discontinuous, continuous means that the basal lamina, so it's that basement membrane is continuous. It connects all throughout. Okay. And then if we get to discontinuous, there's not a continuous basement membrane from cell to cell. So there's actually in the example of the sinusoid down there, we find in the liver and some other places, the cells themselves have holes in them, so they're fenestrated, but then also there's gaps between those cells as well, because there's actually not a continuous membrane connecting all of those cells. So it's just like a cell, and there's another cell, and then a big hole in between that large things can pass through. So that's kind of the two ways to categorize capillaries, is whether or not that connective tissue layer is continuous throughout. And then secondly, whether or not the cells have holes in them, right? Whether or not they're fenestrated. Okay. So if we look at the two continuous types, meaning that basement membrane connects all those cells together, we can have non-fenestrated ones. And so these are the most common. Yeah, we find these in our brain. We find these in our skin. We find these in our muscle. Yeah, so kind of the most common. We see these continuous non-fenestrated ones quite a bit. This is what forms that blood-brain barrier. Okay, and their big role is obviously diffusion, like all of our capillaries are, but then also to seal things off, right? So to create this strong seal, not allow things through unless we want to allow it through, right? So there's a lot of control here in terms of what gets out of the vascular bed into the tissue, and vice versa as well, what gets out of that tissue into the vascular. Okay, so that's kind of our most common, our most kind of sealed off version, most protected version. And then we have continuous fenestrated, so it means the cells are connected to each other, right? But the cells themselves have holes in them. Right? So there's opportunities for things to pass through. This is where we find these in places that do a lot of active absorption and filtration. Okay, so we find these in our kidneys, okay, we find these in our endocrine glands, and in our intestines. Okay, obviously the kidneys are important for filtering blood. Endocrine glands for secreting hormones. Right, and then intestines obviously for absorbing nutrients. Okay, so these are all tissues that are passing in and out of the vascular system a lot for one reason or another. Right, and so it makes sense we have a little bit more porous type capillaries here so you can pass things through. Okay, and then we look at the discontinuous ones. Again, that basal lamina is not connected from one cell to the next. Okay, most of these are what are called sinusoids. Okay, and so sinusoids are the ones that we find in mostly in the liver, but we also have some very similar to this in bone marrow, as well as the spleen. Okay, bone marrow and the spleen, both of those organs are highly specialized to make new cells for us, right? And so a whole cell has to move out of that bone marrow and then get into the blood somehow, right? So it makes sense that there's big holes there for those cells to pass through, right? The spleen is also important for developing red blood cells, as well as white blood cells. And so again, that when those cells pass through the capillaries of the spleen, it makes sense that they're able to kind of actually exit the vascular bed, get modified by the cells in the spleen, and then be able to enter back in. And so that's why we have these large holes, kind of large spaces, discontinuous spaces between those cells. Okay, and then the liver is making protein for us, right? Which are typically large, right? And so we gotta have big holes to get those proteins out. And as well as the liver is responsible for breaking down our old red blood cells too. Right? So it's got to be able to those Kupffer cells we talked about a couple times ago. Those specialized macrophages are there. One of their main roles is to grab onto red blood cells that are failing and need to be recycled and pull them into the liver, recycle them. And so again, we got to have big holes in the capillary beds to pass whole cells or large proteins through. So that's why. And then this also this discontinuous nature also makes blood flow very slowly through these vessels as well. So then we can grab onto things, put things back in, and this is some of the basic functions of this discontinuous capillary beds. All right, questions about any of those?
So just use the plastic approach.
So actually, in the types that we're talking about here, yes, but then we can actually have non-fenestrated discontinuous capillaries. Not really showing any examples of those, but one example of that is in liver fibrosis. Part of the fibrous nature of that cirrhosis actually makes those endothelials connect, and the capillaries become less porous because of that. So that's one example of a continuous when these sinusoids can become continuous. But for our purposes, these three categories are. Perfect. Yeah, so. Okay, other questions on that? Okay, so just take a sec and just kind of analyze these images here and decide which one is which out of those three, as well as which one is most common. And then, yeah, there was a little bit in the book and on the quiz on these parasites. Talk about those for a sec, and then I'll come back to you in a couple minutes.
A is their missing. Yeah, this is C looks kind of.
It's probably.
And looks.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're all good. Yeah.
So yes, they keep penetrating.
Way bigger gap.
Maybe that's just. I think I was wondering about
All right, so what do we got here? Which one would be the most common type out of these three options up here? B, right? What do we call that one? Yeah, continuous non-fenestrated, so the cells are connected to each other, no holes in them, so non-fenestrated. And then obviously the continuous fenestrated here, right? So we see the holes, but they're still connected to each other. And then this would be more like those discontinuous. Oh, sorry, thank you. Because I wrote in this answer. There we go. Sometimes I do that so you don't have to painfully watch me write things. But, okay. Yeah, so that one is our discontinuous, which would look more like those liver sinusoids. Yeah. Okay, the three roles, three kind of basic roles of these parasites, which are sounds like you're saying a parasite, like a microorganism, but I'm not sure how to differentiate that with pronunciation. It's pretty much, I don't know if there's another way to say that. But so these are cells that are kind of on the outside of the of capillaries, and they're contractile cells. Okay, so they have some ability, so kind of like smooth muscle, but not exactly. And so they help to regulate blood vessel growth. Okay, so part of growth of new tissue is always capillarization, right? As we're building new capillary beds all the time, and a lot of that can be regulated by these parasites. And then they also can contract and relax to change two things: change blood flow through capillaries. Okay, so they can contract to squeeze down capillaries, so not much blood makes it through. But then they also can relax to let more blood flow through, but also to open up the gaps between the endothelial cells too. And so capillary permeability can change, and it changes quite a bit throughout, especially during the injury process, right? When we have an injury, part of the and you guys start getting into immunology yet? A little bit, yeah. Not too much yet, yeah. So part of the injury process is leads to a lot more swelling, a lot more fluid leaving capillary beds, and that's dictated by capillary permeability. And so certain factors like histamine release and other things will cause these parasites to relax, which then opens up the gaps between the capillary endothelial cells and allows for more permeability, which is good because we need to get immune cells into that area, right? We need to get other things into that area to clean up the injury site. And so that capillary permeability is kind of controlled by these parasite cells. Okay. Yeah. Questions about any of these? Okay. All right. So when we look at capillary beds, this is just kind of showing what it would look like with an open capillary bed versus a closed one, right? So this would be closed here. This would be with those the little sphincters being closed off here, right? So we don't have blood entering the capillary beds. And this would just be the opposite, showing blood entering the capillary bed. Doesn't mean it doesn't also pass, some doesn't also pass through that shunt. Some still does, but we also have separate event. And so we'll talk about the factors of. Okay, take a second, at least a couple minutes here and kind of work through this little recap with the person next to you. And then we'll come back together here in a few minutes. All right, so 3 blood vessel layers.
All right. Going to cut externally.
External, that's not so right. It's that, maybe I don't need to write it. Because that was not right. I'm struggling with that. It's funny, I'm actually getting some kind of like 10 to 9 here from a wall, but
Like a selfie stick attached to it.
Little walker upstairs and seats.
Yeah, so, okay, so yeah, we got the interna, we got the media, and we got the externa, right? Okay, 3 blood vessel categories, obviously artery, capillary, vein. What would you say the main roles of arteries are?
Deliver oxygen.
Okay, deliver oxygenated blood, deliver nutrients. What else? Homeostatic mechanism, blood pressure control, yeah, with arteries the arterial side is really primarily responsible, along with the health of the heart, obviously, like the heart is what starts the blood pressure, but then to maintain that blood pressure with the role of the arteries. Okay, so those are the primary ones, obviously the capillaries, where exchange happens, right, so it's dropping off nutrients, picking up waste products, okay, also filtering of blood, we'll talk about the lymphatic system here in a second, and fluid is squeezed out of our capillaries every time blood passes through. Okay, and part of that squeezing out process means that some of that ends up filtering through our lymphatic system, which then exposes that blood to our immune system, but that can help train our immune system. That's what's part of what happens in the capillary bed. Talk about that more extensively for the lymphatic side. And then veins, 2 main roles.
Return deoxygenated blood.
Yeah, so returning that deoxygenated blood back, and then
Old blood, soil blood.
yeah, reservoir, right? This reservoir, so kind of have this blood pool there that we can activate and bring it back into general circulation when we need to do something. Okay. 3 types of capillaries, right? So we're going to be continuous, non-penetrated, most common, good for sealing things off, good for controlling everything that goes back and forth. All right, and we have continuous fenestrated, which are going to be good for secreting tissues that tend to secrete things, or tissues that tend to absorb things like kidneys, the talked about the endocrine glands, what was the third one? The
Intestines.
what was it?
Intestines.
Intestine, there we go, yeah, absorbing those nutrients, yeah. Okay, and then discontinuous, also known as sinusoids. Cells actually have spaces between them and their spools, and typically fenestration as well. So those are good for when we have very large things that they pass in and out of vascular systems, or the liver, bone marrow, spleen, tissues that are dealing with large cells or dealing with blood proteins. Okay. All right. Questions about any of that? Okay. All right. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of control of blood flow now, the control of blood pressure. And so we'll look at kind of all the things that influence blood flow in the body. Okay, so when we're talking about blood flow, talking about a volume of blood flowing through a vessel, organ, or the entire circulation for a given period of time. So we're typically going to talk about it either in mils per minute, or volume per time, or if we're talking about cardiac output, then we're going to talk about it in liters per minute, which is reflective of whole body blood flow, cardiac output. Okay, the 2 primary things that influence blood flow in the body are the pressure of the blood It's kind of pushing it along, as well as the resistance to flow. Okay, so when we look at that equation, flow equals. This is the little triangle for delta, right? The change in pressure from one spot to the next, divided by resistance. Okay, so we'll look at the factors that dictate pressure and resistance and how those both affect flow. Change in pressure, yeah, so if we have, it's always going to be going from higher pressure to lower pressure, right? So we're thinking about the bigger the difference is from one to the next, the faster that blood's moving, and that's really going to be reflective of our blood pressure, right? And how fast that moves our blood, and then how much resistance we have to the flow. It's going to be the denominator, so the more resistance, the less flow, right? But more pressure, more flow. Okay, so an inverse relationship with resistance, direct relationship with pressure. Make sense? Okay, all right, so let's look at the pressure side of things first. Okay, so the pressure is really this force per unit area exerted on the vessel wall by blood. Okay, and this is the driving force to keep our blood moving, right? Without blood pressure, for a matter of minutes, we don't survive, right? For a matter of just a couple of minutes, we don't survive, right? So the primary inputs are number one, cardiac output, right? How much blood is the heart pumping out? Okay, because that's the source of the pressure. That's where the pressure begins. Okay, our blood volume is absolutely crucial to our blood pressure. Right, when we get dehydrated, we're literally losing fluid from our blood, so we have less volume, so our blood pressure drops. Right, and then resistance. Okay, so resistance is also related to blood pressure, even though it's also a standalone factor for blood flow. Okay, so obviously our main driver of resistance is vasoconstriction, vasodilation, as far as what can change. Right, so when we look at a systemic level of vasoconstriction, right, meaning that like all the blood vessels in our body for the most part are vasoconstricting, what's that going to do to our blood pressure? Go up, right? Absolutely. So that increases blood pressure. Systemic low degree of vasoconstriction is going to do the opposite, right? So it's going to decrease blood pressure. Okay, that's on the systemic level. But then when we think about this in terms of local blood flow, if we have one certain area that's really metabolically active, and we're going to get more blood flow in that area, we do that by vasodilation. Okay, so this is going to increase flow to that area, whereas local vasoconstriction is going to decrease flow. Okay, so we kind of think about systemic changes in vasoconstriction, vasodilation, and that affect the way that affects blood pressure. Right, and then when we look at something for local changes, we're thinking more about how that affects blood going past that change, right, or blood going into that area. Right? Okay, so the primary way to measure blood pressure is obviously we get systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure. Right? So systolic is the pressure that's created by the heart. It's the top end of that pressure. Diastolic is the resting version of that. Okay, the heart's mean arterial pressure is a way to average these over time. Okay, so the heart in general, the heart's beating about a third of the time and relaxing about 2/3 of the time. Right? So if you want to get mean arterial pressure, there's other equations that kind of get you at the same answer, but this one makes the most sense kind of conceptually to me, because you can see that 1/3 and 2/3 in there. Right, and so you do that, add those together, and you give mean arterial pressure. Okay, so what is that? Somebody pull out their phone and calculate it for me. I actually don't have it in my notes what that is. So if you take 140 over 90 as your systolic over diastolic, what would be our mean arterial pressure?
107. 107.
107. Good. Yeah.
It was sitting there, so I was just doing that every time.
Some people just see equations and they just start working on it.
Guilty.
Yeah, so we're just taking that 140 times it by 1/3, 90 times it by 2/3, add those together. We're believing that's 107. It's still going to be in yeah, question. Okay. All right, so that's kind of the blood pressure side of things, and these major influencers are the thing that we want to be thinking about. Okay, when we look at the resistance side of things, this is obviously the opposition to blood flow, right? How much how hard is it to pass it through a vessel, right? Is really the primary thing. And so as vessels get longer, we get more resistance. Yeah, the longer blood vessels are, the more resistance to flow we have. The more viscous the blood gets, right? So the less like fluid-like and the more jelly-like the blood gets, the harder it is to push it through a vessel. Okay. And then it decreases with increasing vessel radius. Makes sense, right? When we get those vessels bigger, then our resistance goes down. Okay, but it does so with this equation. So this kind of means like proportionate to resistance, proportionate to 1 divided by the radius of the vessel to the 4th power. Okay, so this is the primary way that we change resistance in the body is by changing blood vessel size, right? And it has a very strong effect. Okay, so if the radius of a vessel doubles, the resistance is now going to be 1/16 of what it was before, right? If that vessel size is better, the resistance is now 16-fold greater than it was before, right? So because of that, to the 4th power, this has a huge effect on resistance. Right? Now, certain things, just like any time that our bodies are growing, whether that's due to pregnancy, normal growth, obesity, any of these things, all of this involves adding new tissue to our body, which then adds new blood vessels, which lengthens our overall vascular system, which leads to more resistance, right? And so this is partially connected to why sometimes in pregnancy there can be blood pressure problems, partially connected to obesity being associated with hypertension as well. Yeah. So longer blood vessel lengths leads to more resistance. Okay. Questions on any of that? Okay. A little matching on the next slide here. Okay, so we got kind of factors up there, the letters, and then we got things to associate that with. So which letters would go in each of the numbers there, and then you can kind of put them here. All the things that are kind of determining our blood pressure would be here. Okay, so yeah, just take a second and think about which of these factors would connect to blood volume, which to cardiac output, which to peripheral resistance.
So I think this is just.
Yeah. So I guess just might be how much right now.
And also be resistance. Yeah. They didn't do that.
Yeah. Especially with that. Just test diet.
Yes. It is embarrassing. Like, we just like, that's good, we do.
Yeah.
And just understanding how.
Yeah, that was like. That kind of kid.
Yes.
Just outside.
And I think that's.
All right, let's go ahead and come back together here. So let's start out with peripheral resistance. It's actually kind of the maybe somewhat less obvious one here. Which ones did you put under number 3 then?
Blood vessel length.
It's an A, yeah, blood vessel length, for sure. Okay. What was the second one?
C.
C, yeah, blood viscosity, for sure. And then what's next? Diameter, absolutely. That's really our big factor as far as what we can change and control, right? And then another one we didn't really talk about, which what makes sense though, would be with G, right? Yeah, absolutely. We have obstruction, atherosclerosis, plaque buildup, narrowing of arteries, right? That's going to increase resilience. And which two go with cardiac output?
Stroke volume.
Okay, that's heart rate, stroke volume, right? So we got heart rate is B, and then stroke volume is P.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why would vasodilator not that pretty out there? Because if we're like acting on the.
Yeah. No, it definitely does, because it affects afterload, right, like we talked about last time, and so, yeah, some of these definitely overlap with each other, for sure. Yeah, but it affects afterload, which is a component of peripheral resistance, right, and so it's kind of, they both connect, for sure.
On
that
same thing.
Yeah.
Obstruction. What that's.
Yeah, that also increases afterload as well, which then would potentially lower stroke volume, which would lower cardiac output. But it does so by creating more resistance, right? So kind of the order of things, so, yeah, kind of like, yeah. But they're definitely intertwined for sure, yeah. Okay, and then the last two here, are just the water loss versus water gain. Here, okay, F and H. And then if we look on this next one, this just kind of shows that graph. In the way that it was, what mixed it up. Okay. All right, questions on that at all? Yeah, and this recording too, you know, it's on the video too. If you want to get it from the video. Okay. All right, so one more thing to talk about before we dive into kind of a little bit more details on capillaries is this idea of shear stress in arteries. Okay, when we are really in all vessels, but we're going to talk specifically about arteries. When blood is passing through a vessel, there's kind of two types of flow that it can have. Okay, so laminar flow is that flow velocity is increasing as it gets closer to the center of the vessel. Okay, so this is looking at laminar flow here. Okay, so because of the interaction with the blood against the walls of the vessel, because of the little bit of churning that happens, and when blood interacts with something physically, the outside of the vessel, the blood is flowing a little bit slower, right? Whereas that inside of the vessel, where it's not interacting with anything physically, is going faster, right? So that's this idea of laminar flow is that, okay? And that's kind of the normal blood flow when we're not increasing our blood pressure drastically, we're not exercising. That's just kind of what blood flow typically looks like. Okay. But then when we, for multiple reasons, so one obvious one is just when we start exercising, we need to increase our blood pressure. So we increase our cardiac output, we start increasing flow throughout the body. And in certain areas, this leads to turbulent flow. So we want to kind of think of churning of blood. Spinning of blood. All right, so this is kind of like, think about a nice slow flow of a river, right, versus the rapid section, right? So it's kind of like the turbulent flow is the rapids, okay? And so when we get turbulent flow, our endothelial cells have little mechanoreceptors on them that are actually sensing turbulent flow, and that turbulent flow is really called shear stress, right? So shear stress is how much pressure we're pushing out on the artery walls, and those endothelial cells are sensitive to that. And so when they feel shear stress, and it's detected via those mechanoreceptors, that sets off a chain of events on the inside of those cells, which leads to nitric oxide production. And then nitric oxide production leads to vasodilation, and the vessel gets a little bit bigger. Okay, and that's kind of a normal part of the process. And so, yeah, that's kind of there. So it's detected by those mechanoreceptors on endothelial cells, which look just like little cilia, pretty much. And this stimulates signaling pathways, which eventually leads to nitric oxide production. Release, which then that leads to vasodilation. Okay, so you can see that's just one of the pathways. If we look at all the different things that happen in relation to shear stress, right? So this activates a bunch of transcription factors in those endothelial cells, right? A bunch of them, okay? So quite a few, definitely don't need to memorize all of those there. But we have lots of different things happening in relationship to shear stress. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those in a sec. But the likelihood of turbulent flow is dependent on a few different things. So number one would just be overall velocity of blood. Okay, vessel diameter. As well as viscosity of blood. Yeah, the book had kind of a long drawn out section on all of this, but I just kind of wanted to introduce it to you in a basic fashion that turbulent flow is kind of a signaling event that leads to lots of changes within our blood vessels, which part of that is we need to have that turbulent stimulus. We need to have that increase in shear stress to keep our endothelial tissue healthy, right? And this is really the role of exercise with blood vessel health is we get that in those times, those periods of time where we're exercising of lots of extra shear stress, which kicks off all of these transcription factors, which activates all of these different things, which in the end keeps our blood vessels healthy and moves us away from cardiovascular disease. If we're always just sticking with that laminar flow, then we don't get that same kind of stimulation to our blood vessels. And so, yeah, so that's just kind of a little bit of a side note here, but a definitely important part physiologically of how our vascular system works is we're dependent on having some stimulation of turbulent flow throughout each day to keep our blood vessels healthy. Okay, questions on any of that? Okay, so let's talk about capillaries a little bit. We're going to work through some examples here that kind of help us understand what capillaries do. Okay, so when we think about that blood making its way from the artery down to the little arterial to the capillary bed, what happens in the capillary bed is some fluid is squeezed out in the capillary bed. Obviously, oxygen as well, other nutrients come out, but fluid actually leaves the capillary bed. Okay, and the amount of fluid that leaves the capillary bed is dependent on two driving factors, right? Number one is hydrostatic pressure. Okay, hydrostatic pressure is really our blood pressure, right? How much stress do we have pushing out on the walls of the capillaries? Okay, but then number two is the osmotic pressure. Right, and that's driven by the factors that are in our blood that create osmotic pressure. Right, so that's proteins, that's the ions, all of those things that are solutes, right, that help our blood to hold on to fluid. Okay, so hydrostatic pressure is pushing out, osmotic pressure is pulling in to the capillaries. Okay, so hydrostatic pressure is going to be highest closest to the arterioles, right? Because that's the side where the blood pressure was created. And then lowest closest to the veins. Blood pressure drops as it passes through the capillaries, majorly because we're actually losing fluid, right? Fluid is leaving the blood vessels, so less pressure as it passes through. Osmotic pressure should stay the same as long as nothing's moving out. Okay, proteins are the main driver of this osmotic pressure. Okay, and so proteins aren't typically allowed to leave the blood vessels that pass through a normal capillary bed, so that pretty much stays the same. Okay, so when we look at this equation for filtration, which is a way that we can kind of get an idea of how much fluid is going to leave a vessel, the little pi symbol is denoting osmotic pressure. Okay, the P is our hydrostatic pressure. Don't worry about the filtration coefficient. That has to do with blood vessel with capillary permeability, as well as some of the charge of the molecules along the capillary wall. And for our cases, we'll just leave it the same as a constant. Okay, and then the C is just talking about it in the capillaries, right? And then the I is talking about it outside the capillaries in the interstitial space. Right, so we have to look at both hydrostatic and osmotic pressure inside the vessel and outside the vessel to determine which way fluid is moving. Okay, so this is kind of our setup here, right? We got the blood coming down this arterial, right? Some of it's going to make its way into this capillary bed. You can see here, if you take averages for a whole day, about 20 liters of fluid exits via our capillary beds. Okay, and you can see on the arrows there, fluid is leaving the vessel in the beginning because that's where hydrostatic pressure is the highest, right? So A would obviously be where hydrostatic pressure is the highest. Okay, and then as that fluid leaves, we have less hydrostatic pressure. And eventually that hydrostatic pressure, if it drops below osmotic pressure, then osmotic pressure is now the dominant pressure and starts pulling fluid back, right? And that's what's happening here in B. Okay, hydrostatic pressure is the lowest, back somewhere around B. Okay, so of that 20 liters of fluid that got pushed out of our capillaries per day, 17 of those liters comes back right there in the same capillary bed. Okay, so we push out 20 liters, pull back 17. Right, this is adding up all of our capillary bed total, so a lot of space getting on the time. But that leaves 3 liters, right? That leaves 3 liters that didn't get brought back. And this is the primary role of our lymphatic system. Right? Because all of our capillary beds have lymphatic capillaries around them too, and kind of adjacent to them. And so that 3 liters of fluid needs to get picked up by our lymphatic system and get filtered through our lymph nodes, which forces it to interact with our lymphocytes. And if there's any foreign things in there, our immune system will get trained against that, and then that fluid gets sent back to the vascular system. Okay, so that's kind of the basic setup here. Questions on this so far? Okay, so then when we look at this, we can calculate actually fluid movement here. Okay, and so if we look at the arterial side versus the venual side, this gives us the equation down here again. Okay, go ahead and do these calculations. Okay, we have the arterial side here, right? So that would be like in this region, right? And then the venual side here, it should be like in this region. Okay, so this is the arterial side, this is venual side. Okay, calculate fluid movements, and so that filtration number you get, if it's positive, that means fluid moving out. If it's negative, that means fluids coming in. Okay, so do those 2 calculations. Plug those numbers into the equation. Don't worry about the constant. You don't have to do anything with it. And see what you get. Okay, go ahead. Work on that with the person next to you there.
And Dr. Sorg.
Yeah.
So it's not, when you think about high pressure, is it's like osmotic pressure.
So onconic pressure is the osmotic pressure contribution by the proteins in the blood. So there's other things that contribute to osmotic pressure too, like ions and other particles. But the onconic pressure is specifically the part that's contributed by the protein. That makes sense?
I was just thinking about Henry. I took a girl to last night. I thought it was early enough, but I didn't know it was. I know. I went in June and we went and there was a few displays that like desert camp and where there was like
Guys didn't know you're gonna have to do math.
Like, I went on that, and I was like, it like, put to sleep, and then like, I was like, it's so much better. And I was like, it's. I was like, I don't know, they were like, freaking out, they're like, we don't have that, they're like, why don't you do that? And I was like, oh, my God, maybe I'm just getting talking about, you know, like, knock out on the lane. It's not a good.
All right, so let's come back together here. Okay, so what's our number on the arterial side? What did you guys get? 12, okay, and then on the venule side? -8, okay, so equations look something like that, right? 34 minus 22, got 12, 14 minus 22, -8, okay? So obviously the positive here means fluid is moving out. Negative here means the fluid is coming back in. Okay, so that just kind of sets us up with what it looks like normally. And we're going to talk about a couple pathologies here in a second that kind of show us how those numbers can get changed and why that might lead to edema, right? Because edema is really an issue with this equation right here, right? And so we'll talk about that in a second. But questions on this before we keep going? Yeah, yeah, you should, if I give you those numbers there without the equation, you should be able to do that calculation.
No equations.
Yeah. Good question. Okay, other questions on that? Okay, so just a little bit here about the lymphatic system, okay? So the purposes of the lymphatic system are to, number one, recover that fluid, that 3 liters a day that we just looked at. Okay, in that fluid, we got nutrients, gases, hormones, and some proteins, right? We got to get all that stuff back. Okay, what's our total blood volume in the body? Yeah, 5 to 6 liters, right? So 3 liters is extremely significant, right? That's half of our blood volume or more. So this is not like a small thing to lose 3 liters, right? So this is a very important function of the lymphatic system. Okay. Also, fat absorption. We talked about those lacteals a couple weeks ago, right? Getting those the micelles and then the chylomicrons, all of that, getting that back to the liver is the lymphatic vessels are responsible for that. Okay, and then defense, obviously, lymphocytes are found here, B cells, T cells, and they're just kind of housed in the lymph nodes, right? And so when that fluid passes through, it has to interact with it when we have an antigen presenting cell that goes and finds a pathogen or antigen of some sort. It's going to bring it back all the way back to the lymph node to present it to those helper T cells, right? So all that's happening here in the lymphatic system. Okay, there's a couple of different vessel types here. We have lymphatic capillaries that look somewhat similar to our other regular capillaries. There's also a couple different vessel types. So the initial lymphatics, ones that are closer to the capillary beds, these are somewhat similar to veins. They have no valves in them. But the one difference is when the space around them fills with fluid, which could potentially increase pressure and flatten those vessels. It does the opposite actually, because they're anchored to the tissue around them. When it fills with fluid, it actually opens up the lymphatic vessels, which is obviously very helpful for keeping fluid flowing through the lymphatic system. And then we have the big collecting ducts that we can see here that hook back into our large veins in our thorax and other places that send that fluid back to the vascular system. Okay. All right, so a little bit about edema, just some common causes of edema here. So number one, hypertension. Right now we know why. Right? If we see that hydrostatic pressure number go way higher, right? Then that number is going to become more than 12. And on the other end, maybe we're not even positive, or that number is going to be less than -8, right? And so just by throwing those numbers off a little bit, that can lead to edema, right? Liver failure. Right, so liver failure leads to ascites, which is this right here, this fluid buildup in the abdomen, right? And there's 2 things really going on with liver failure. Number one is hypertension in the liver itself because of the fibrosis in the liver, like we talked about a couple times ago. So that leads to high blood pressure, makes the blood just much more turbulent trying to get through there. But then also, if the liver's not functioning well, we don't make much albumin, so then we got low osmotic pressure. Right, so we got high hydrostatic pressure, low osmotic pressure. We'll work through that example on the next slide. Okay. If we have any leakage of plasma proteins in the interstitial space, this could be due to injury, right? Musculoskeletal injuries result in tearing open capillary beds, right? And when that happens, everything that's in the blood gets dumped out into that interstitial space, right? So all those plasma proteins, cells as well, right? So those cells die out there, all that stuff is left out there, right? And that leads to a bunch of extra solutes in the extracellular space, right? And so that makes for high osmotic pressure out there. Okay, kwashiorkor is what happens with very low protein diets, right? With malnutrition. Same idea as the liver failure, but the liver's not the culprit. It's the fact that the liver doesn't have the right nutrients to make proteins, right? And so if it can't make proteins, it can't make albumin, can't make you don't have as much oncogenic toucher, and osmotic pressure is lower. And it is a very sad, just the translation of that is the sickness the child gets from the baby times, right? Because breastfeeding is the best source of nutrition up to 5 and 6 years old at times, right? But then if a new baby comes in, obviously that baby's going to get priority over the breastfeeding. And now that the toddler now doesn't have access to the protein using her diet anymore. And so that's why it's called that. Yeah. And then we can have obstruction of lymphatic drainage as well, right? So injury leading to inflammation, which can smash some vessels at times, post removal of the lymph node, checking for metastasis, and then certain parasites can destroy our lymphatic vessels as well. Okay, so let's take a look at this example now. We'll do this exact same calculation with someone with liver failure and hypertension. Okay, so go ahead and do those calculations there and see what numbers you come up with here. Go ahead. All right. What numbers did we get there? What do we got for the arterial side? 39, and the venial side? 19. All right, so in this case, I mean, I did kind of just make up those numbers, but in that case, there's really no return of fluid in the capillaries. Now we're fully reliant on the lymphatic system to bring all of that fluid back, right? And so that's one example of how this can work if we have liver failure. Okay, go ahead.
So I was just thinking about how there's an exchange, so it's releasing and then reabsorbing the lymphatic side. So would that mean that the lymphatic system is responsible for 20?
Yeah, in that case, yeah. And this is going to vary depending on where we're at too, right? So in liver failure, we have lots of high blood pressure in the liver itself, but then maybe in our other vessels, we don't quite have as much, right? So that 20 is looking at the whole body. Fluid movement. But yeah, but in this region of the body where we had numbers like this, there would be zero fluid coming back in the capillaries. Yeah, so then the idea would be for you to be able to kind of do a calculation like this for any of those any of the edema problems we looked at here. Okay, so you can kind of do that here in this little recap. Okay, so we got ankle sprain, hypertension, kwashiorkor, liver failure. Kind of what's the underlying problem? What does that do to our hydrostatic pressure in the vessels? What does that do to osmotic pressure in the vessels? And then which way would fluid be flowing? Okay, take a second and work through that. And once you finish, we'll take a little break and get the so get ready for the presentation. Okay, so with the ankle sprain. Underlying problem is, we got, what's going on? It's our big problem. Selena, what are you gonna say? Yeah, broken tissue, broken capillaries, so then we have a lot of extra stuff out in the extracellular space, right? So we got increased solutes. In that interstitial space. Okay, so does that have an effect on our hydrostatic pressure in the blood vessels? Not too much, right? Yeah. So this way of an arrow, no change. Osmotic pressure in the vessels. Doesn't really change there, but relative, yeah, so relatively, now that's gonna be lower than the pressure in the interstitial space, so nothing necessarily, but that interstitial space is a, sorry. That interstitial space, osmotic pressure is very high, right? So that's the problem. The pressure in the vessels themselves didn't necessarily change, but now it is lower than the pressure out there in the interstitial space. So we got high interstitial osmotic pressure, which leads to fluid flowing out of those vessels. Okay, hypertension, obviously high blood pressure. Okay, hydrostatic pressure in the blood vessels. And it goes up, right? Yeah, so we got high hydrostatic pressure there. No real effect on osmotic pressure. Okay, again, fluid is flowing out. Because that more fluid is flowing out than normal, and then less is coming back too, right? Because there's a point at which, as the blood is passing through the capillary bed, there's a point at which hydrostatic pressure drops below osmotic pressure, right? And that's when fluid starts coming back. But in this case, that point's going to be closer to the venial side, right? So less time for that fluid to be coming back, and that's so we're going to have more fluid going out. Okay, kwashiorkor, underlying problem here. Yeah, so low protein diets. Okay, hydrostatic pressure in blood vessels. Yeah, no really change there, but osmotic pressure in vessels. Yeah. So again, the point at which hydrostatic pressure drops below osmotic pressure is now pushed closer to the venial side as well. Right, and so the time when fluid reverses from flowing out to flowing back in is later, right? So we're not gonna recover all 17 liters of fluid like we did. It's gonna be less than 17, right? And so it's gonna be more stress on the lymphatic system, and some of it will stay in the interstitial space. Obviously, all of these are pretty much out. And then liver failure, we've got two things. We have high blood pressure in the liver, but it's called portal hypertension, right? So in the blood going to the liver has high hydrostatic pressure, but then we also have low plasma proteins. Okay, so hydrostatic pressure in our blood vessels here. High, right? Osmotic pressure in the vessels is low. Right, so this is an example we just worked through on the previous slide. So yeah. So being able to just kind of wrap your head around those and understand why there's edema in these cases is what I want you to get at. Okay. All right, questions on that? All right, let's take a 5 to 7 minute break here. And then when you come back, we'll have the presentation. Here. Let's see, turn this back on. Okay, all right. Yeah, we're gonna talk about the coronary blood flow a little bit. We'll talk about a few special areas of blood flow regulation, and then we'll get in a little bit more physiology and how we control. Finish up. Okay, so Sounds like you guys have already been diving into coronary blood flow, quite a bit in anatomy. One kind of interesting feature is to view that the coronary arteries right and left come right off of the aorta, right there, and you don't even really see it in this image, right? You can kind of see it down there, but normally when we just look at the arteries, you just put deep to flank, you can cover it up with connective tissue, but they're coming right off. So obviously this is the first thing to be blood. Okay. The one interesting part about this is as heart rate increases, coronary blood vessels dilate due to local and chemical factors. So then the blood getting, or the heart is getting more blood. Obviously, just like any muscle tissue would, when it's active, it would get more blood. So more of that blood immediately gets shunted to into those coronary arteries. Okay, couple coronary artery pathologies that I already mentioned. Heart attacks are heart attacks along with strokes, the number one cause of death in the U.S. But before you typically get to that, the patient might suffer from angina before that, which is temporary or partial blockage of some part of one of these coronary vessels, which can just lead to some chest pain, sort of angina, chest pain. But it can also be caused by spasms of arteries as well, but probably more commonly caused by atherosclerosis, hardening and narrowing of the arteries. Okay, and so a lot of people that have chronic angina will have nitroglycerin with them at all times. Right? Nitroglycerin is really the synthetic version of nitric oxide. For example, so really the same chemical, and it causes massive vasodilation throughout the body, and so it tries to open up those blood vessels of the heart so we can move away from that ischemia that's starting to happen that leads to that pain in angina. And then myocardial infarction, MI, heart attack, number one cause of death in the U.S. About 1 in every 40 seconds in our country is occurring. And yeah, so this is obviously the complete blockage of the heart, which leads to the death of that myocardial tissue. And heart muscle just doesn't feel very well. There's some surrounding areas that might have just suffered from limited blood flow, that might free loss of blood flow, that might recover from a heart attack, but the heart cells themselves that have that complete loss of blood flow typically don't come back. And as we talked about last time with heart failure, a lot of times that is replaced with kind of these like fibers connected to it. So you can have this portion of the heart that's not really contributing to the pump anymore. Okay, so atherosclerosis, which eventually leads to a thrombus, a clot, that's typically the cause. So the progression of atherosclerosis is that building up of the plaque, that eventually that plaque ruptures, then it starts a clot right there, that clot, and then eventually break free, roll its way down so it gets to a smaller artery to where it fits, right? It gets stuck there and cuts off blood flow from there. Right. And then obviously bypass surgery or stents would be the two most common surgical procedures to help with this. And so shown here, right, so we can see that stent put in, similar to what the lady was just talking about with obviously smaller, one of these coronary arteries. And then cabbage or coronary artery bypass graft, typically a vein is taken from somewhere else. The saphenous vein is a pretty common one. You guys run across the saphenous vein, and yeah. So a lot of times that one is used, but literally just skipping part of the blood flow system of the heart, going straight from the aorta typically, or past the blockage, and then sewing that into the heart, skipping that block part. It's really what the bypass surgery does. Yeah, go ahead.
I learned that it's the PA's job in the OR to interact with something.
Okay, nice. Yeah, so they're taking care of that while the cardiac surgeon is opening up the chest and doing all that. That's very cool. Cool. I know there's other ones we use too, but I know that in general that tends to be common one. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's talk about a couple special areas of blood flow. So blood flow, the skin is under slightly different control than the rest of the body. And so the skin is really contains our primary means of dissipating heat in the body. Okay. So this happens obviously via sweating, but also very importantly via vasodilating all of the blood vessels in our dermis. Right? The epidermis, that epithelial layer, which doesn't have any blood in it, because right below that is the dermis, which is heavily vascularized, lots and lots of blood vessels, lots of capillaries. And so
Yeah, one interesting fact about this and how sensitive our body is to temperature change. It's a 0.081 degrees Fahrenheit change, triggers the hypothalamus to do something about that. And so whether that's, if it's rising that much, then that triggers the hypothalamus to set off the events on the bottom part of that flow chart there, right? So body temperature increases, or sorry, on the top part, body temperature increases there, okay? That's gonna lead to vasodilation, okay, of the skin blood vessels. Okay, and yeah, so typically, what this is saying is typically sympathetic nervous system control causes vasoconstriction throughout the whole body, right? That's the normal response to norepinephrine release onto blood vessels. But in the skin, we kind of have this opposite effect, where other neurons kind of override the effect of the sympathetic nervous system and cause vasodilation in the skin. Okay, and so we're sending more blood to the skin as we get hotter, right? So that's kind of this first response, as well as we activate sweat glands at the same time to help us get rid of that energy. Okay, and then just the opposite, if our body temperature drops, the hypothalamus is kicking off vasoconstrictions in the skin, so we're keeping blood away from our periphery, keeping it into our core, but then also activating shivering to work on that. Okay, so it's kind of this unique part where sympathetic nervous system control is overridden by other factors that lead to vasodilation instead of vasoconstriction. Okay. Questions about it? Okay, so let's talk about blood flow control in general. And when we talk about blood flow control, we really have two different kind of ways to look at it, the local side of things and the systemic side of things. Okay, so we're going to start with the local, which is also known as intrinsic control. Okay, so it's really kind of like the tissues themselves are the ones kind of driving the changes in blood flow. That's why it's intrinsic. Okay, and the first part of that is called the myogenic response. This is really kind of this immediate reaction that the smooth muscle is pretty much just reacting against blood pressure changes. Okay, so in the case of high blood pressure coming to a certain area, that puts a little bit of stretch on our blood vessel walls, and then just the natural reaction of a smooth muscle to that is to kind of constrict down against that. Okay, and there's some protective mechanisms that help with that, or that are helpful for. Like if we set too high a blood pressure flow into capillary beds, then the capillary beds burst. Right, so if all of a sudden we get this high amount of blood flow going to an area, the reaction is just to constrict down to kind of save our capillary beds beyond. And that's pretty much what this myogenic flow is looking at. Okay, and this is kind of helping to keep blood flow constant under conditions that are always changing, right? And the opposite happens too. If all of a sudden blood pressure drops drastically in one specific area, then the smooth muscle contracture kind of dilates to allow a little bit more flow to pass that. But all of this is just kind of an immediate reactive response, and it can't be overridden by these other responses that we look at. Okay, so metabolic changes are very important, especially for those precapillary sphincters as well as the arterials. And the easiest way to kind of group this and think about it is anything that we would expect to see building up as far as the chemical goes in response to doing a lot of metabolism. Those things are going to cause vasodilation, roughly. Okay? Because that makes sense. If a certain area is doing a lot of metabolism, then it needs more oxygen to be sent there, right? So those things would cause vasodilation. So what kind of things would we see released from active tissue? What are byproducts of metabolism? Yeah, CO2. Okay, so increased CO2. What else? Yeah, so increased hydrogen ion concentration, or we could also call that decreased pH. The lactate itself also is a local vasodilator. Okay, related to the nervous system, potassium levels being high also leads to vasodilation. And then the last one is just temperature, right? So increased temperature is also vasodilation. Okay, so these are kind of all results of increased metabolism are going to lead to local vasodilation. Okay, the opposite is true for the other one. So I mean, literally just the opposite arrows for all of the other for vasoconstriction. low CO2, low hydrogen oxidation, high pH, low lactate levels, low potassium levels, and lower temperature will all lead to greater constriction locally. Okay, low oxygen levels in tissues also leads to the release of HIF1, which is hypoxia inducible factor 1 alpha, and this also can lead to lots of changes, which some of those are increased vascularization of the tissue. Okay, so this is kind of partially how we grow new blood vessels in response to things like exercise, which sometimes decrease the amount of the oxygen in our blood. But when the effects of exercise increase capillary density, and so part of that is related to this hypoxia inducible factor. Okay, so that's kind of the local control that we would see on a tissue by tissue basis. Okay, but then we have this kind of overall sympathetic response, which is more the systemic control. Okay, so these are systemic responses. So as we talked about with the quiz, most blood vessels are going to constrict under sympathetic control. Okay, and for the most part, these are the alpha-1 receptors. Okay, so we can see these right here. Okay, vasoconstriction of most vascular beds driven by alpha-1 receptors, and that can be either norepinephrine or epinephrine binding. Okay, norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter typically being released by sympathetic neurons, but then epinephrine will be the primary one in the blood being released by the adrenal medulla. Okay, blood vessels around muscle can actually dilate under sympathetic control, and that tends to be driven by beta-2 receptors. Okay, so we see that over here, and those are preferentially going to be adrenaline or epinephrine is going to be the one that's most likely to bind to those beta-2 receptors. Okay, so many of the alpha-1 receptors are found, in the actual synapse, right, where we have other receptors, beta receptors, kind of all over the side, right? And so that's kind of one way that we can get some vasodilation even under sympathetic control. The sympathetic control would normally vasoconstrict everything, right? But that doesn't cut it for muscle with active, right? Muscle with active when you vasodilation, and you get more blood to that muscle. So part of that is driven by these special beta-2 receptors that actually lead to vasodilation in those areas. Okay? And that's going to happen in areas that are potentially getting more blood already, because that's coming from the blood, not from a neurotransmitter. Okay? So if we're already sending kind of more blood to that area because of some of the local factors we talked about on this slide, right? These local factors are also overriding the sympathetic nervous system. Right? So those are also causing vasodilation. So that already sends more blood there. And in that blood is epinephrine, right? Because the epinephrine came from the adrenal medulla in the blood. So we're kind of getting these two different factors that are overriding the typical systemic vasoconstriction, where we get both the local factors, all of the metabolites that are going to vasodilation, and the epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. And both those things are overriding systemic vasoconstriction. That makes sense. Okay. So veins under sympathetic nervous system control, we already talked about this. This is how we mobilize that blood pool. Blood pool, a blood reservoir. Okay, and then arterioles are going to constrict under sympathetic nervous system control, and that's going to be our primary way that we increase our blood pressure. Right. So when we're doing something like exercise that requires a lot of blood flow to a certain area, requires a lot of cardiac output, we need to both increase blood pressure systemically, because that makes our blood travel fast through the body, which is what we need. So we need that systemic vasoconstriction, but then we need certain areas to open up. And we talked about how those certain areas open up. Right? So we need both those things happening. We need high blood pressure to circulate blood fast, but then we need local vasodilation in those areas of the happen. Okay. Questions on that? Okay, so a little bit about autonomic control of the heart. We talked mostly about the heart last time, but just a little bit more detail here that's related to these receptors that we were just talking about. A couple more terms here. We talked about chronotropy last time, right? What did that mean? Affecting what?
rate.
Heart rate, yeah, so chronotropic agents affect heart rate. Okay, dromatropy, we didn't talk about that last time. That has to do with affecting transmission speed. Yeah, so the electrical system of the heart is actually sped up under sympathetic control. Right, so you get that signal around the heart faster. Okay. Inotropy, we talked about that last time. What was that one? Affecting what? Yeah, contractility, and the force production of the heart, so contractility. And then lusitropy, we didn't talk about that one. That one is affecting relaxation speed of the heart. Okay, and that's an important one because when the heart rate speeds up, we have less filling time, right? The less time there is between contractions, the less time we have to fill up the heart. And so the faster we can get the heart to relax between beats, then the more blood we can put in it, right? And that's one of the problems. That's actually so there's two types of heart failure. Last time we talked a little bit about systolic heart failure, which means we don't have a strong enough pump. But diastolic heart failure is we can't relax the heart enough, right? So both of those types of heart failure are equally as devastating to the body. Right? If we can't relax the heart enough, it's so stiff and doesn't actually open up, so we can't get enough blood in there, right? So that means cardiac output is low. If we don't have enough preload, right? So both of those things are really important. So the ability to control it, to relax the heart really rapidly between beats is absolutely essential to cardiac health. Right? So lusitropy there. Okay, so as you can see here, the parasympathetic nervous system, via acetylcholine release on those muscarinic receptors, decreases all four of those things. Okay, and then sympathetic nerves, which are releasing norepinephrine, dealing with both types of beta receptors, beta 1 and beta 2, increases all four of those things. Okay, there's also the muscarinic cholinergic receptors have a negative effect on them, like we just talked about. That's just showing this right here. Okay, but then also they block the release of norepinephrine from the sympathetic neurons. So there's connecting points between some of the vagus nerve, some of the vagal outputs actually to the sympathetic neurons that can slow down the release of their norepinephrine along the way before it actually gets to the heart. So kind of some of that IPS stuff going on before the sympathetic neurons actually make their way to the heart. Okay, questions on that? Another thing that caffeine does for our heart is it speeds up those calcium pumps in our sarcoplasmic reticulums, in our cardiac myocytes, which leads to increased lusitropy, right? Because if we speed up those calcium pumps, that's how we relax the heart, right? As we suck calcium out of it, right? Get it off of troponin, which allows the heart to relax. Caffeine actually activates those calcium pumps and helps us relax the heart faster. Okay, all right, let's talk about some broader reflexes here. Okay, so baroreceptor reflexes. Again, this is part of the systemic control of our blood pressure. Okay, there's multiple parts of the brain that we're kind of talking about here that deal with this, but they're all related to the medulla. Okay, so the M in all of these acronyms is the medulla. Okay, so the rostral, ventrolateral medulla, it's just kind of talking about different parts of it, right? The front part, the top part, the different. So the acronyms are not too hung up on, exactly, but it's just really talking about the region of the medulla that these different actions are happening that we're talking about here. Okay, so input is coming from baroreceptors. We have baroreceptors here in the aortic arch, and we also have it here in what's known as the carotid body. Okay, so two places that we're constantly monitoring blood pressure, which obviously makes sense, right? Right at the aorta, where we're sending blood to our whole body, right? And then right here at the bifurcation of the carotid arteries, where we're supplying blood to the brain, right? We're constantly monitoring blood pressure there, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, so carotid sinus, this is a branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve that's going to innervate that part. Okay. And then we see a branch of the vagus nerve, which is innervating the aortic artery. Okay, so this reflex is activated when increased pressure is sensed in this area. Okay, so we got increase of pressure activates this, right? Then it kind of goes through this whole chain of events, right? So the neurons from the vagus or glossopharyngeal nerves, depending on which of those two we're talking about, okay, are going to release glutamate into another little section called the NTS, okay? Activating them to release glutamate at another part of the medulla here, okay? And then that activates those neurons to release GABA, right? And then GABA is going to be inhibitory, right? So then that eventually inhibits the activation of sympathetic neurons. And so for inhibiting the activation of sympathetic neurons, what would we be doing the heart rate there in response to this increase in blood pressure? Decrease it, right? Yeah, so we're decreasing heart rate. Okay, which also decreases cardiac output. Okay, and then we're dilating blood pressure here. Okay, so again, the stimulus was that increase in pressure. Right, that increase in pressure, the overall effect is going to be some way to decrease pressure. We do that by decreasing cardiac output, and we do that by opening up the blood vessels. Okay, so this next slide just kind of walks us through those things there. Okay, so yeah, take a sec with the person next to you and just fill in those neurotransmitters. Just try to understand that this is where we're starting, right? So there's the baroreceptors. Okay, so work your way there. You got to see where the little neurotransmitter, like where the arrow points to the spot. Okay, fill in those neurotransmitters, and then this is just the parasympathetic side over here. Okay, so take a second and fill that in. We'll come back together in just a second.
Yeah.
But so this, so all the ratings, they all, I know this is can be more, so. These.
All right, let's come back together for the last few minutes here. So one thing that I love about studying physiology is you don't necessarily have to like memorize every single little detail. Granted, there's lots of details to memorize, but a lot of this stuff just makes sense if you think about it too, right? Like this whole idea of like building up metabolites from doing a lot of metabolism. If we're doing a lot of metabolism, we probably need to breathe more, right? We probably need some more oxygen in that area. We probably need to clear out more CO2, right? So kind of some of these things, it's really, really important as you're studying this stuff, it's like take a step back and instead of just kind of like memorize each little detail, like take a step back and think like, wait, what's going on here? What's like the big picture here? And just make sure that's all connecting for you too, because we can get so hung up in the details because there are so many details to memorize that sometimes we can't, if we just take a step back, like, oh yeah, of course, that goes back because of course we need more oxygen because we're doing metabolism, right? Like a lot of it does just make sense. So I just encourage you to kind of take those steps back every once in a while, make sure that we're figuring it out. Okay, so let's walk through these briefly. So increased sympathetic nervous system activity. What would that do? Vasoconstrict, vasodilate? Constrict for the most part, right? We talked about some examples that are different with muscle and skin, but constrict, okay? Decrease SNS, less constriction, or what we say, dilates, okay? Increase oxygen locally. What would we see there? Local what? There's so locally, increase oxygen, good. Constriction, absolutely. We've already got a lot of oxygen there. Now we don't need more, right? Yeah, we're good. That must mean we're not doing much metabolism, right? So that would be constriction. Okay. Decrease CO2 locally. Constriction again. Must mean we're not doing much metabolism if we don't have a lot of CO2. Increase CO2. Dilation. Okay, increase hydrogen ion locally. Dilation as well. Okay. Then we get into these systemic reflexes. Okay, if we have high CO2 at the carotid sinus, right? That's our chemoreceptor reflex. What do we need? What are our blood vessels doing? Constrict. Okay. That's the sympathetic nervous system, right? So that's those two are really connected, right? How do we activate our sympathetic nervous system? We can activate it different ways, but one way to activate it would be sensing high CO2 levels in the blood. Right? That would make us want to constrict, right? That would increase our blood pressure because we got high CO2. That probably means we're doing a lot of metabolism in the body with better increase our blood pressure, so we can increase the cardiac output. Do that, right? If we got low blood pressure, the aortic arch. We didn't really talk about that one, right? We talked about high blood pressure, so it's kind of the opposite of that baroreceptor reflex. So what would our heart rate do? Yeah, so we increase heart rate. All right, we said that increases cardiac output. Okay, and what are our blood vessels do? Yeah, it's good. Okay, and then so that's the idea. We're not getting enough blood out of the heart for some reason, right? Why are we not getting enough blood? Well, one way to help with that would be to increase the flow out of the heart, right, with cardiac output, and make those vessels a little bit smaller, so our blood pressure increases and we can move the blood faster, right? Okay, so high blood pressure, the carotid sinus, this is the one we work through. This would decrease our heart rate, right, which would decrease cardiac output, and then we would dilate vessels. Okay. Yeah. Not necessarily, but they can go together for sure. They don't necessarily have to go together like on the very high end, right, where like maximal exercise, we got lots of sympathetic activity. When that starts dropping, we're not necessarily really kicking in much parasympathetic yet, but eventually it will, like as we get the lower end, but yeah. But similar effects, really, right? Increase in sympathetic would have the same effect as increase in parasympathetic. Yeah. Okay. All right, guys, good to be with you today. Have a good rest of your day. We'll see you next week. All right.